Hello! Welcome to Writing Off the Deep End.
So I'm Mary Thaler.
And I'm Geoffrey Edwards.
And today we're going to talk about illustrations and artwork in our writing practice.
Right, so a little bit off the beaten track for writers because I don't know how many writers actually illustrate their own work, but...
Well, and actually I can't speak for you, but I will say before we even start that I have no formal training in the visual arts.
Me neither. In fact, I wasn't even gonna, I thought it was beyond the pale, beyond reach, until you started to sort of say, I showed you something that I did.
Yeah.
And you sort of said, well, you could do more of this.
Yeah. Well, that's what's great about being in the arts and literature, that you can, there's so much to explore. And this turned out to be a whole new world that was sort of opened.
And you've been doing it for a while. So how did you start doing illustrations?
So what happened was, I had an idea for a story, and it turned out it really, really needed to be a comic. And I didn't have any artist friends that I could persuade to draw it for me. So I started doing it myself. Because
for my science fiction, it's so sort of over the top in some ways that I've often felt that it needs a kind of illustration component to help people make sense out of what's going on.
Yeah.
And I relied up until now on real artists as opposed to my own ideas or
commissioned
my own
somebody.
Or... So I actually commissioned people to do, for instance, with an eye on cover art, to do a few things and some of that's been very nice. But I always thought that my drawing wasn't very interesting. It wasn't good enough. Although, and I have tried to do bande dessinée or comic book kinds of things before. And then I sort of realized that maybe it didn't really matter whether the art was really, clever, well put together, if it portrays something interesting, and it's the structure of the story and the way the illustrations go, the visuals go together to tell the story that is interesting, and not so much the quality of the art per se. And that sort of started to shift my ideas about whether I should do this or not.
It's funny you put it like that, because my advice for new writers and what I really deeply believe is important about writing is just giving yourself permission to do it.
So another thing, I can draw freehand, but I'm not, again, I'm not very happy. It depends on what I do, but it takes many tries for me to draw freehand and get something I like. But while I was doing fashion design, and I still do fashion design, I discovered that most fashion designers will draw an image of what they're planning to do, and then they'll turn it into the garment. But I didn't operate that way at all. I learned to manipulate patterns directly without going through the image. And by trial and error, developed my garments through pattern manipulation.
That's interesting.
And I did so using Photoshop or different tools to do that. And so I realized that you didn't have to go the route that everybody else went if you could find a way that makes things work. And so for drawing, instead of freehand drawing, I find images, photographs on the net that have elements of what I want. And then I use that as a kind of a backdrop. And then I redraw over the top. So I include some of the elements of the backdrop, and then I invent other things and that seems to work as an approach.
And you work on your tablet?
I do. I do. I've done watercolors in the past, and I've done freehand sketching in sketchbooks. But I like the iPad as a tool, and I find that with a really good software so I have this really good software that imitates watercolors. And so I find that gives me a huge flexibility to do interesting illustrations. And so I actually use two different drawing applications on the iPad, one which is a more straightforward standard one, and then and then the watercolor one, which I combine to get effects.
Cool.
Yeah, maybe we could start looking at some. So this is the first one that I did. We'll show it to you in a. So it's an image taken from one of my novels that I wrote in the 3-day novel contest we talked about at one point. So it's a future Montreal. So this is an image taken from Saint Denis Street in Montreal, which I have redrawn over the top to make it future, run down, everything's in ruins. And then my main character, who's this unusual character, is walking down the street. And so, and it's done in a kind of stylized way. So with a lot of color, right? Yeah. So that's, it's maybe not the best painting in the world, but it illustrates something about the atmosphere, I think, of the opening of the book.
The color palette, the feel of that, the sensations that the characters are having in that scene.
Right.
In the book.
And then I did another one recently, which, so in one of my books, science fiction books, I talk about Jonahs, which are they're a descendant of the sperm whale that navigates between stars as a kind of co-adapted species working with humans, but who transports the humans.
A living spacecraft.
A living spacecraft. Yeah. So I developed an image of a Jonah, which is a sperm whale in space.
I adore this part of your novel. I want a whale spacecraft for myself.
So again, it's not bad for giving this sense of the space, and the sperm whales, like the modern ones, they don't feed off plankton because there are no plankton, but they feed off nebula, the gases in nebulas. And so I put a nebula into the image so that you can see that they're near to their feeding spaces. And so it's first attempts to look at illustrating different parts of the book. So tell me a little bit about your...
Well, let's see. So what I have here are actually, we call them zines. And if some of you might be familiar with that word, but if you're not, a zine is a small self-published book. And when I say self-published, I really mean I went down to the library and I ran it off on the photocopier. And then I stitched the binding on my sewing machine at home. But when we make zines, we get to participate in this wonderful zine culture. There are people who make zines and organize fairs, and you go and you swap zines and you mail your zines to your friends. So for me as well, stepping into this world of visual storytelling allowed me to step into this wonderful writing. A community that I hadn't known before. So we started with this one. I thought it would be cute to do it quarter size.
So what's it called?
To the people I loved who didn't feel that way. This one, I mean, there are now copies of this out loose in the world. There are probably people who are in it who don't know because my drawing isn't good enough for them to recognize themselves.
So this is hand-drawn with a pencil,
exactly. Right? I drew it with pencil. I drew lots of drafts. Then I did a good clean copy and I inked it. And then I scanned it and printed it. It's very analog technology. A few years later, I went through an interesting experience where I was living in Iqaluit and I didn't have a place to live.
The far north we're talking about.
Right. Iqaluit is the capital of Canada's one of Canada's Arctic. So it's a small town. It's a very cold town. And it is a town with a severe housing shortage. And while I lived there, I actually didn't have any place to stay. And so to have a place to stay, I would take care of people's pets while they were on holiday and in exchange be allowed to stay in their apartment. And so I was adjacent, I think, to an experience of homelessness, which is a widespread problem, shockingly, in the Arctic. And having gone through that, I knew that it was something important and something rather hidden. And I wanted to write a piece about it, but I don't write prose nonfiction essays. And so what came out was my second zine, pet sitting in Iqaluit, and it was the story of my 4 months that I spent without a home in Iqaluit. So it really did free me to do new things that I'd never done before. This has made me think of, and I know it's something that I'm obsessed with, but setting is something that we have to tackle in prose and in visual forms, but we do it slightly different. But I think there are a lot of similarities, and I think it's very telling that the first picture you showed me, you said, this is Montreal, it's a future Montreal, and we ended up talking about setting. And that's something that visually you can do a lot of interest with, because the mind perceives it in an instant instead of having to read a paragraph of description. Yeah.
I think maybe we
wrapped
it around for this time and maybe come back to it somewhat later when we both have a little bit more experiences.
We'll give you updates on our artist portfolios. Coming up for our next episode is something that relates to Geoffrey and my specific experience. As you might have known if you've been watching these episodes, we live in a French-speaking city, although we both write a lot in English.
English is our first language, and French is our second. But it's hard to live in a French city and not feel pulled to write at least partly in French. So don't forget to click on the button at the bottom if you like this series and would like to subscribe to it. Mm-hmm. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.